Audio, volume up. Okay, all good. Stuff can go away. Mute myself, move that over there. All this floating UI. Okay, think we can get going. Okay.
Oh, welcome to the AICAD. One of the junior team, majoring in redesign practice in our center, and I'm here for volunteering the panels for today. And as you may see, this panel is about leveraging the generative AI to enhance conceptual abilities and communication design. And if you have any questions or any concerns about the contest, then please let me know on that. I'll let them know about but let's just do the event. Thank you for the time.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming. Hi, my name is Chris Becker. I'm also actually I'm a graduate of the media design program here at ArcCenter College of Design. I also teach here in the graphic design department. But today I'm going to give you a quick talk. This is sort of split into two parts. I did share these lecture pieces in the Wovia thing. I'm actually finding the Wovia thing, since it's not a website, it's like sharing a link or any of that stuff is like not as convenient. But the UX designer in me is just like, what's going on? But again, there's no perfect, as I like to tell students, and as they spend more time, that's the way that works. But essentially, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. We're going to talk a little bit about the idea of conceptual abilities in sketching, how this is sort of translating into using artificial intelligence to enhance those abilities. And then we'll engage in a short exercise sort of modeling this behavior internally. I'll share those big jam exercises with you guys. If you don't have a computer, it's totally fine. I can even sort of like, hey, I'll draw it yourself, or we can draw on a piece of paper and sort of figure it out. The idea is leveraging these tools, thinking about how they work. There's a lot of them that exist out there, and we'll be using Visual Electric. Has anyone played with Visual Electric? No. Or there's another one called Next.art. These guys contacted me out of San Francisco. There's literally like, they're like mushrooms. They like pop up all over the place. There's no like sort of single one way to do that. It is a conversation. Just interrupt me, raise your hand, give a call. We'll do this a little bit as we go. And hopefully that leads to some outputs. So a little bit about myself. So I'm currently a adjunct professor at Otis College of Design, teaching product designers, but user experience design. I also teach here at ArcCenter in graphic design department, teaching web technologies. And then I've also written books and mentor with Design Lab. I also am a senior user experience designer working with agencies around Los Angeles and the world to some extent. And I've written a book, writing another one, whatever. You can look me up if you want. I write on Medium and some other places like that. I also mentor with ADP List. And I find this stuff really fascinating. Most of what we teach is this long sort of arc of design. And I'm just curious, let's just go around really quickly and I want to, where in the world are you occupied and what subject do you teach? Or if there's multiple, that's fine. We'll start over here. Oh, great. Cool. Thank you.
Graduate studies, teach design theory and research.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you.
But I really work with faculty members and having sense of how to work with.
Awesome.
I'm Rick Jacobs from the College of Art and Design. I mostly in creative writing, but also AI coordinator at the college.
That's awesome. Oh, okay, cool. Awesome. thank you everyone for being here. Obviously, a wide spectrum of stuff that sort of relates, and the reality of the tools and the things that we teach is artificial intelligence is going to touch all of them at some level. I will sort of focus on the idea of generative AI and using the specific skills that artists and designers use at which to enhance those or create them. Now, again, I'm educated here. I also went to Colorado State University, and with graphic design is my sort of background. But essentially, it's human-centered design, and there's a lot of different systems that go into doing that. I'm a huge advocate that systems thinking is the way in which to sort of help designers and students and institutions sort of move their ideas forward, but also support a lot of different ways at which of making, right? The speed and the pace at which we can do that will make our world a little better, or we can sort of solve problems at higher tilt. And the role at which systems and web technologies and all these things sort of interface with new ways of making is what designers need to sort of enter the world with that outputs. So really, this sort of starts with the idea of like conceptual abilities. Some of the books that I like sort of sharing with students most of the time is these ideas like Bruno Munari's The Art of Design, like hand making. How do you get the craft of what you can do with your hands into the work that you make? There's a long strategy of sort of the overlap of the skills that artists make and skills that we can do in making things in the world, and what typical art skills would sort of be translated. And then, of course, Paul Rand's The Designer's a Designer's Art. Again, very much about the hand making. These are designers of older year, right? They were not using some of the same technologies as we would ever use today, but there's a lot to be sort of translated or learned in this opportunity. Now, most of what we do in teaching students is an idea of expanding their conceptual skills, right? Conceptual skills, including things like strategic thinking, using qualitative and quantitative data, how do you talk to people and understand what they're doing, decision making. I know that this is the right path for these reasons, right? I know that it resonates with my audience. I know who my audience is, et cetera, et cetera. There's also visual learning and leadership. Like, how do you know that your team is going to the right place? You are going to join organizations, and you are not going to be able to head them at first, but you will need to understand your ability to use a lot of these conceptual skills in translating or applying the things you know to solve problems, right? It's sort of a big arc. We want to solve problems. I talk to students all the time. I just want to solve problems. I'm like, what problem? Like, there are people problems, there are technology problems, there are the pothole on the street problem. Like, that is like, generally there's lots of ways to go about doing that, but then you can think, well, how do you as a thinker align or use your ability to tell a story or apply the knowledge that you have back into that conceptual relationship, right? Artists and designers for a very long time have used things like, oh, I can draw really quickly. I can tell you that the size of that thing isn't the right, it's like the ergonomics isn't going to work because I can sketch it out and I know the body says, or they relate the problem solving into the ability to visualize or think about their systems. Now, the larger we get, the bigger people we deal with, the larger teams we're involved in, then starts to go into things like change management. How do you know your application works? How do you know that it's sort of feeding back into the systems that you need? And then those then could sort of get underlined into like what I like to call the I word, like we're going to be innovative. Like, what does that mean? Because innovative is just like, and then it's like, I want to make it user friendly. I'm like, yeah, great. Or I want to make it sort of use all the things that it's supposed to do. I'm like, you can make something equally as innovative by just making the button what you want it to do as you can, like involving this, like it pulls from 8 million data points and it boils it down into this one little essence of what you're going to make. Now, the role at which students can access some of these things for both micro and macro sort of thinking is part of what is sort of, I sort of love doing, but it also is there. And I'm curious, for those who sit with teachers or even in your own making, how many of you like to draw or sketch with your students regularly? Great. Okay. We got a couple that like to draw. Here's an example of a game that I even play with my 5-year-old. Any of you have done Exquisite Corpse? No, about Exquisite Corpse? Okay, great. Oh, you did kind of Monday.
I teach a horror class.
Oh,
The text. Well, in the class that I know.
really? Oh, I recently had my 43rd birthday, and I'll grow my friends over, and we actually did Exquisite Corpse. It's like the party. Everyone's like, "God, you're such a nerd, Chris." And I'm like, "Yeah." I'm leaning into it, guys. Like, this is what you're gonna get when you're around me. This is what we do. But I've even sort of figured out how to do this in remote teams using Figma, like people across the world, mostly as a way to say, hey, what we make all the time doesn't always have to be client facing. It can also just be something that's fun that your team gets around and sort of engages in and applies that. Now, most of these things apply on this idea of drawing and thinking and communicating, right? Like the core of how you sort of get through the world and do things. And I like sort of quotes. I like, there was the previous architect in the world. I prefer drawing to talking. It leaves less room for lies. This is my favorite thing to tell the students, because most of them can talk. Hopefully, like most of them have an ability to communicate with their words, but when it comes to actually getting the ideas across, you have to combine those things together. Drawing, making your thing, and then communicating about why it works or doesn't is a huge component of how this thing can be successful or where it's going to go. Now, part of drawing is its thinking, right? You are actually literally thinking through either the words or the space, the composition, the outputs. And most people think of drawing, even students, at the rendering space. I'm not good at drawing, they say. Like, wait, can you draw a box? I'm like, no. Like, draw a box. Oh, that looks like a pretty good box. Feels like you got all the corners together. Like, what makes you not think you're a good drawer? And most of that comes from a long scale of education, or they go into an art museum and they see Van Gogh, they go painting or drawing, and you're like, no, like what? No, that's not, that takes years of training and cycle. But most of us can stay in this realm over here of tiny little boxes and circles and communicating. And where generative AI is really sort of helpful is you can still stay in this low realm and help you render the things in the world that you couldn't do without some level of skill or outputs. Now, the reason I sort of advocate is sketching at its core is really fast. I'm a user experience designer. I've been doing it for a long time. And I started with drawing, and then I go and I sit with people and I work with designers. I'm like, just draw out the idea. I'm like, oh, I got to use Figma. I'm like, no. Like if you can't solve it on a whiteboard or on a piece of paper, no software is going to help you. Figure it out first and use the tools of rendering, i.e. Figma, to execute thinking. Like I carry a notebook around with me all the time. I've committed to certain notebooks, and my students are like, well, why are you carrying that around? And I'm like, look, I solved your problem. I was doing it on the toilet last night. Like it made me think about it, and I just had to get it down. Like use it in your own relationship. But the role of sketching is that you don't have to treat it nicely. It's like, no, that's crappy. Or my favorite is like, you use a lot of loose sheet paper. Like, nope. And the satisfaction of like crumpling one that you like hate and throwing it away. Like we don't get that from like the trash thing sort of gives you the sound and the affordance of that. But like, even when I was going to grad school here at Art Center, most of my work was like, how do we make the tangible stuff come back into the world of making a computer? Because the idea of moving sheets of paper around and it moves files in your document, or like taking a color and making your computer screen be that color, like all that kind of stuff is really fun. But the role of sketching and thinking that way is really about that. And at scale, these are how we solve problems, right? I would much rather sit with a dev team who can work out a whiteboards problem and then go execute it into a user solution than endless meetings of wireframe with clients whose eyes literally glaze over because they want to see the final product. And I spend a lot of time with students going, well, if you can figure it out here, you can make it clickable with relative speed, actually faster speed than we ever could before. And then you get your audience playing with stuff. The minute you get your users or your clients to go, oh, yeah, oh, okay, I see how that works. They are not having to use their imagination. Most of what we do in design is trying to get people to understand the systems, the flow, the outputs of what we build. And the role of this stuff is that this doesn't just come out. You got to practice to some extent. Most students' drawings start really poorly. They're not that neat. They can't draw on a whiteboard effectively. And so you have to train the rudimentary skills, sort of being confident in even just using a whiteboard and approximating size and space. And then, that's where you introduce more drawing tools like rulers. And I send them to UI stencils. Have you heard of UI stencils? So like they print a little phone thing and you have little like icons that you can fill in and stuff. Like, don't draw the Twitter logo. I mean, I guess that was a little harder before. Now it's just an X, but you get my sort of point. Now the role of a lot of this stuff is, yes, sketching can be sort of start with your thinking, build some stuff as you go. And the role at which we sort of align that back to conceptual abilities is that part of teaching students to do stuff sketch or whatever is in this relationship of modeling behavior. The best instructors that I ever knew weren't just telling me how to do it. They were like, come over here, see how I organize this? What about this little question mark over here? Did you figure this out? Like, no, well, what if it did this, this, and this? Like, you could see their thinking in the options or the relationships that went into that. And that has opportunity to show students not only just, hey, I can tell a different story, but how do I get past the gap that I was struggling with or engaging in? And there's lots of ways to do this, right? We teach a lot of process from users experience design to design thinking, and we're research, spend time with your users, like whatever. You can talk about this until we're blue in the face, but until a student goes and researches it or goes down to a location and sees a detail that they couldn't experience any other way than getting out in the world, they can go do that. I was just chatting with this guy that knows me from the internet, whatever. He was like, hey, I recognize you from the internet. I'm like, cool. I don't know what that is, like good or bad. And he's like, no, we just sort of know each other. And the immediate what came out of it was, how do you get students to recognize that they have to go do it? They have to experience. And the role at which we spend time in this stuff is that we want to motivate them. Most of instructors' role is motivating. Is anyone familiar with the fog model? Has ever seen the fog model? Okay, so the fog model is based on this idea of where you can teach someone a behavior, and there's a motivation layer and a like how hard it is to do and how easy it is. Most of what we sort of spend time in is if what you're asking your students to do is hard to do and they have little skill at it. I need to move this so you can see that. Their abilities are low and it's really hard, they will fail, right? It's like, anybody who made a souffle from scratch? Right? If you've never done it before, you'll probably fail at making a souffle because you can mess it up. Like you can make it too hot and the eggs roll, and I'm not even a cook. I've just been watching the British baking show. You watch these people fail and you're like, ha, ha, ha. You're like, wait, oh no, I think that's the role, right? Of like sort of seeing these things and doing that. But with practice, you sort of learn these basic skills. And the role at which we as designers sort of spend time is that the reality of this is learning design lives over here. It's high, it takes a lot of motivation. If you're not motivated to be a designer, you will fail because it is hard. And some people think, oh, I think it's gonna be easy. I'm like, no, what made you think it would be easy? And they're like, oh, well, you know, it looks fun. I'm like, yes. You know that people do, like, is being LeBron James easy? He makes it look fun, but it's hard. It takes lots of hard work. There's lots of practice outside of the relationship. But the role at which we can use these things is sometimes we use tools like AI. They're easy to use. Many of you use ChatGPT. Maybe you find it difficult to use. No, there's a reason. It is pretty simple, right? Now, it has like a barrier to entry to like typing like, well, tell me about myself, or like, give me a paragraph of this topic, or tell me the top 10 diseases in the world. It's like pretty, like, it's still like essentially Google. And what I find sort of fascinating about like the AI world is like we've gone back to prompt-based computer research. It's like we're back in the 70s when like you had to like open program B, enter. Like what? Like nobody wanted to use that. Like the whole invention of software and outputs is because people didn't want to do that. Like Bill Moyers is like, no, this is terrible. Like let's make a UI that people like to use. Yes.
But the big difference that before we told it to do something, we told it right away, we do the same thing every time.
Yes.
That is not at all.
Yes.
Something different.
Well, and that sort of relationship of like, it's weird because before we relied on computers to do what computers do really well, and we're still doing that. AI can still do those things, but the outcomes of it learning behind you is really fascinating. Remember like a year ago, like all the hands were mangled? And if you learn to draw, like do a drawing class, like what do you mess up the first? Like what do you not want to draw at first? Their hand, right? Hands, feet. Like I was just like, man, the allegory of a computer not drawing hands very well is equivalent to a student learning in a drawing class. Composition, size, proportions. Like I still am bad at it. I'm like showing my son, like, here's how you make the box, and then you divide it, like all this stuff that you learned in a certain outputs, but the computer has to do the same thing. And you're right. The relationships of how it changes is actually some of the interesting parts. I think, what was that article the other day? Like why AI can't spell raspberry? Strawberry. Or whatever. Yeah, okay. I knew it was a fruit. I totally got it wrong. And it's like, but once you take it in, you're like, oh my God, it's because it's not actually generating knowledge. It's making connections, and those connections can be skewed or be off. And there's an article that I've sort of included at the end of this talk that is sort of fascinating, that right now we have so much AI flooding our systems that it's learning from AI. And so now you have this like, oh, well, wait, like if now we have everything is sort of skewing, it's all learning from itself. And it's sort of like now if you have bad inputs and the AI is continuing to learn that, it'll skew it into a space that is quite dangerous or even like becomes less trustworthy, right? That's what happens. But that means that we need artists and designers to input better stuff, right? And we're sort of translate that. Now, when we start with good concepts, we can sort of align audiences or our students to say, well, what are you trying to do? What do you need the tool to do for you? Are you trying to visualize data? Where's the data coming from? How do you do that quickly? An AI can take lots of data points and visualize it for you if you know what to visualize first. Saying, I have data, ChatGPT, tell me what I need to know, is not a great way to use an AI, right? But there's an opportunity in which to visualize those things and then draw connections, which human beings are miles ahead of any artificial intelligence in making connections. Now, artificial intelligence can only make connections that it was given to make connections about. Very important thing. It's like, yeah, we have a large language model, but it's still only fed by a box. It can't see the whole world. It can only see the stuff that was put inside of it. And the role at which we play in sort of understanding these concepts and realigning them is an idea is sort of the crux of what we're trying to get students to think about. You make an idea, how do you know it's good? How do you know it's the thing that you want to make in the first place? How can you move that idea out of a piece of paper into the world, into the ways that you design it? And the roles of using tools to execute those things is the fun part of doing design, but also it's this like recognizing good concepts. Yes, that is a sound correlation. That means you have an insight. That means that you understood something, but only because you were able to pull it out of the world that you see and execute it into the world back again. Now, it's a feedback loop. Now, the role that we play in sketching and prototyping as a whole is, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to go out? Are you trying to learn a lot? Are you trying to make a lot of stuff? Or are you trying to refine it? Most students get stuck here. They don't want to do more than one idea. They have a hard time exploring multiple solutions to a single input of what there is, the options, right? And part of that is showing them, hey, have you considered the options? Do you know the requirements? Do you know how many things there are? I was working with a student. She's like, oh, I want to make a drop down for all the cars in the world. What? And you think a drop down, I'm like, just Google how many car manufacturers, and I could show you. And I went to the terrible website called rockauto.com. I don't know if you've seen it, but there is a table of every car part you've ever wanted to see in your life. I'm like, you want to replicate this? She's like, oh, no, maybe that's not a good idea. I'm like, okay, drop down, one option. Search, another option. Predictive text, another option. And then whatever. She may not know these things at first, but the minute you are there as a student, you can start saying, like, your job at first is to explore the options, right? And think about what those are at the broad sense. And then once you choose one, then we can refine it. Then we can move from sketch to wireframe to mid-level wireframe to design system, et cetera, et cetera. Those things get more complicated. Now, the reason this stuff is sort of relevant is maybe you may know John Dewey. I'm a huge fan of his as an educator, as a reformer, but I think it holds true that we don't learn from doing, we learn from the experience, right? We learn from reflecting on it. You may do a thing, but you don't learn anything until you stand back and go, oh yeah, oh, that sucked. And nothing will be a better reflection on experience than your end users testing your terrible idea. And I always like to tell students, like, you better test a really crappy thing first. If you learn it fails in an afternoon of a sketch, it's way better than if you invest millions of dollars and think that it's going to work. You have lots of people counting on it being successful, and then it isn't. And a lot of them think that that's the way the world functions, or they want it to do that because they think that their ideas are precious. And I'm always like, no, your idea is not precious. The execution is precious, but you have to work really hard to do that. Now, technology as a whole, AI as this relationship, is really a way in which to sort of extend to help us think. And I'm sort of advocating at the realm that AI is not the solution tool. It is a tool to help us do more thinking. And at some level, we're trying to navigate lots of options, right? Lots of paradigms, lots of computer systems, lots of ways in which to think about the world, and the role in which we can sort of translate that back into ways in which to make and make more for thinking about these paradigms will help us then in translating that. And what that sort of looks like in education is sort of fascinating. Like, where does it live? You're like, well, it can live lots of places. This is not this is from a interesting research paper I was reading about, but really the role that AI can play is helping in the instructional process. Was that too hard to understand? Was that procedure really challenging? How do we break it apart? An AI can help you break apart a really complicated process and automate it. Actually, most of AI is sort of focused on automation because someone has thought through the process. They know that it works a certain way, and that works great for logistics. That works great for processing. That works great for lots of programming types of things. But it also can help students in collaboration. Like the level of effort to sort of send out your thing, the risk you have to take, sort of show it to someone else. And the feedback loop that creates that is part of what we do in design classes is training them to do that. But if that could be augmented or assisted by a reminder, like, hey, we're going to send this out no matter what on this date. Like, I think there should be more forceful hands kind of stuff. Like, hey, I did this thing. And at 12 p.m., it's going to go to these 5 people, no matter its state or no matter what it is. And that's mostly what we do in classrooms, right? Students show up and we're like, hey, you two, look at her thing. Like, does it work or not? Give feedback, play with it. If it doesn't work, I want to see you guys giving feedback. I want to know what didn't work and why. And that is the sort of collaborative process that we train or we model in behavior. But that also helps us in learning the process of how well that was effective. That's where I think some of this, especially tools that we do, I think there's going to be more of that in there. How long did it take them to see it? What did they kind of give feedback on? How did that result in change or modify the system as it is? And that's kind of stuff that, using even more tools like Maze.co or ListNet, all these user testing tools that can sort of go into giving better feedback. Now, many of you may be familiar with generative AI. How familiar is everyone with generative AI? A little bit. So generative AI is at its core, it is a subset of the larger idea of artificial intelligence. This big sort of research guide, all the realm of AI. And then you get machine learning. And then on top of that, you have neural networks. On top of that, you have deep learning. Again, I'm not some expert in a lot of these things. I just know that we focused on generative AI because it sort of is a subset of a very specific set of tasks, visuals, typically rendering things that it can pull from the world, right? And most of that has to do with what designers make. Most of what designers make is in the realm of the visual, right? Sometimes it's writing, sometimes it's best when it is a combo of, and what I sort of love about AI is that it is a combination. It is AI, it's writing plus drawing plus execution plus iteration. That's where that can sort of be extended. Now, most of generative AI sort of breaks down into 2 sort of models, right? The large language models out of machine learning and the diffusion models, which is mostly about this idea of which some of these you may know, Midjourney, DALL-E, stable diffusion, and then the large language models are things like ChatGPT, Gemini, Lambda. These are also from the big players, right? And most of them influence themselves because ChatGPT can go to a diffusion engine like DALL-E and render you an image. If you say, hey, make me an image with this, of this output. That's sort of how those things are sort of translated together. And some of them are more specific, right? What's sort of fascinating about a lot of the world of AI, as it grows, we have more specialization. Like naturally tools specialize into specific outputs of. So you're in the gaming world, there are gaming AIs that are just for making character renders that at some level reduce the number of humans you need to build those things, but at some level speed up the relationship of how you produce that. What was it? Illustrator just released you take a 2D image and then spin it in it with AI, and it renders all these sort of, and it's like, okay, cool. Well, that was an illustrator's job, but now the illustrator is using that thing to sort of turn it. And I love there was the response of a guy's like, do you know how many times I've had a client ask me to just tilt it? And I was like, no, I have to come retry. Remake that thing. The answer is yes, but it costs you money. And now the answer is, how tilted do you want it? I'll go show you the 12, but it then becomes the same sort of, now we have another problem, right? By doing that, you've introduced the opportunity to do that, and then you have a client of how decisive are they of the turn. And I don't want to be in a meeting where you're looking at 25 different curves, like relying on a client to go, I think it's that one. Like, really? Like, now we're back to the wheel of where a designer should be understanding the problems, relating that, building the solutions as we need. But the fascinating thing about a lot of these is that they are sort of focused on specific aspect. And where I think we'll see some level of innovation is being able to own your own outputs. I recently heard a talk from the Beetlejuice director. What's his name? It's just, Tim Burton. And they were talking about why he did Beetlejuice 2. He's like, I just wanted to get back making stuff. I had fun with the sculptor. We got to do this old things that we sort of did in the 20s. And he's like, and I guess I could train an AI to draw like me, but that would be boring. He's like, I can't draw any other way. And that's why people come to me. And I've like worked on this experience my whole life, and that's part of the what I bring to the table. And it is unique, right? You know, CCA or whatever. Cal Arts is like, yeah, keep telling him that you learned something special. I mean, I think he would have done that on his own, no matter like sort of where he went. But I think there's this opportunity there to think that that is the idea of rapidly generating that. And if, as designers and students, I think there's an opportunity to think about how can you start training a thing that helps you make. And if you get to own all of those sketches, or you get to own all those drawings, and you are working on practice, but it is training a thing that assists you later, like that is a weird sort of like, I have a third arm that's drawing next to me and it's drawing it better or whatever. Like that could be AI driven. And in reality, that's sort of what we're going to be sort of practicing to some extent. Now, what makes generative AI sort of fascinating is it enhances the generative AI is essentially an assistive model, right? I first got started with this with Scribbled Diffusion. Has anyone ever played with Scribbled Diffusion? It was like an early model. It was sort of fascinating. It was like this idea of like a Post-it note, and you could like draw, and it would like render something for you, and it was really fast for students. It's like, wait, this is like giving them a Post-it note and say like draw a cat. They're like 2 seconds, and then it renders like a cat, right? And you don't need very many lines, but it's based on the role of outputs of drawing. And so a lot of this stuff came out of Google Labs and some other places like that. And it has, and I ran a workshop with this, which I'll show you some samples of. And then somebody bought Scribbled Diffusion because it was costing them too much money, and they sort of like put it behind a paywall. And I was like, okay, now I got to go find another free tool, which is where Visual Electric came into play. Visual Electric is also sort of rendered outputs, sort of relies on some level of your sketch plus a description, and then it can sort of get close. And there's a lot more of this world that's happening in the realm of helping the artificial intelligence render a composition that is closer to what the artist was making versus having to describe it. And so if you can draw and you can write, your AI can potentially narrow its decisions or options for you as a designer faster, right? And what's fascinating about it is that it doesn't take a lot of rendering time, drawing time, at which to execute a really sort of fantastic image or whatever that is. Does that make sense? And there's a lot of this. And what is fascinating about a lot of these things is a lot of them are generation, which is they're not perfect. They require the hand of the maker. This is where I'm like, it's a tool. If you as a designer understand that if you're not good at drawing, but you continue to draw and then use the AI to help your drawings get better, you will learn where your drawings fail, and the AI can't render that. There's a quick feedback loop of like, oh, yeah, my head didn't look like a head. Like I didn't connect. There wasn't enough detail in there for it to understand what I was talking about. And even people who use Midjourney effectively, or there's all this like prompt engineering. I have to learn exactly how to tell it to do the right thing to get exactly what I want. And that's not that fundamentally different than training designers to use all of the design, all the skills of design to render what they need, right? And that's decision-making that happens in the background. But if you're making those decisions and then off-porting it to a computer to do for you, it's fundamentally not that much different than using Figma or any of these other tools, except we have some hand in making that stuff do what it needs. And what this sort of looks like in practice, and also to show you some of these. So this is a workshop I've run with a number of groups. This first version of this was, and I'll sort of share with you the sort of the FigJam page or the outputs. We use a lot of FigJam. Most of this was started during the pandemic, so it's sort of related in this like, oh, I got to get groups of people that are around the world. FigJam's great for this sort of stuff, and then you can sort of translate that. And this resulted in, it was for a workshop with Boston College. They have a group called DForge. They do a Catalyst, like sort of workshop-y thing. And I ran this workshop with them, and the way this sort of came out to be, I think it's this one. So the premise of the workshop is, which we'll practice this in a second, but the idea is draw a quick sketch in FigJam, make essentially a post-it, give your name, their sort of prompt, which I went back and forth with my wife, it was an architect, like, what is the prompt? Like, what do we tell these students to make? She's like, you got to make it something that they can do quickly, but it doesn't take too much. I'm like, well, what about like a house in outer space? And she's like, oh, that might work. And I'm like, cool, okay, house in outer space. Every student was sort of able to render a house in outer space. Some of them are kind of interesting, some weird, right? Like, I sort of love that the drawings are outputs. And then as they translated them, they put them into Scribbled Diffusion, and then they had them render a more outputted content. So I'll show you, like, the one that was really weird is this. Where's that house? This one. It's like, I don't know, it's like a cactus house. I'm like, great, cactus on the moon, sure, like whatever that is. And what I try and get them to do is include the prompt. So yes, you have this drawing. This says a house on Mars. Not a lot of detail, but we relied on this, so it relied more on the sketch. Here, there's more about sailing through the stars with a cat sitting in a bathtub. Like, this doesn't necessarily have all those details, but as it gets rendered, because it's being told to, you fundamentally can iterate your initial offering in a low sketch. Then you can now add words to it. How does it sort of extend itself? And this is done in 20 minutes with students, right? To sort of engage that. Similarly, we did one with Design Lab, who I teach or mentor students with on the side, and depending on the outputs, like drawing a quick thing, making a dwelling in space, way to sort of push your idea of creative making. Then there's also like deliverables. I need to make a UX scenario. I need to understand the situation in which my audience is sort of engaging in stuff. Or this one was a futuristic wearable device. Like, okay, think about what the things could be in the world. And now they can sort of render, like, I don't know, like a tablet that comes out of your hand, an eye patch thing, like all these potential products that many of them not product designers or even sort of understanding ergonomics of outputs, but they can render an idea pretty quickly. And then the outcomes of that sort of have these futuristic relationships. And then they can go in, and this was done with Visual Electric, and Visual Electric has a set of styles, like it has a future, like lens. Like, well, what does that future lens mean? I'm like, oh, well, it means this. Like, it sort of paints it uses purples and colors and blues. You sort of see that there's decisions being made in the background by the artificial intelligence, but it aligns to this concept of what can it do. And we were working on more storyboarding or outputs. What is the scenario? How can you make this thing feel more real in the outputs that you're designing? And that's where the description of the object or the way at which it renders speeds up a student, right? Now, is this a good shoe with lights on it? No. Like, arguably a shoe designer would be like, right? Like, what do you do? Like, but with time and skill, understanding how to render a shoe more effectively can then ultimately, and that's the sort of industry's guys, like, well, yeah, now we can speed up the sort of execution of that on a billboard, or send it to China and they can produce it for us in speed because we can send them what it actually is supposed to look like, et cetera, et cetera. Now, these opportunities, obviously, there's different ones like this. With the last 20 minutes, does anyone want to do this? Yeah? Okay. So I have shared in the Wovia app this exercise. And so what you can do is you can jump in here. What's the best way to do this? I wish I should publish a public link. So this isn't open, but what we do is we're going to do the dwelling in space exercise. If you have your computers, you can pull it out and you can sort of get into this. I don't know if I've shared this outputs. We'll try and render this as much as we can. But the role at which this is doing is we're going to spend the first, like 5 minutes essentially drawing a dwelling in space on a card. The last link, yes, in the Wovi app. Yes, absolutely.
Like, there's the idea and there's the execution. And like those drawings are kind of terrible. But they're iconic design when it comes over to outfit. And it's in that graphic line, but then the costume design friends.
Well, and that relationship, right? That speaks just like specialized skills for specialized humans, right? He wasn't a costume designer, but he had the idea, and then a costume designer could take that render, take that idea, and move it forward with more skill and experience. AIs can sort of do that, but that now we can do that with, like, go to a specialized. There's a clothing AI, there's a shoe AI, there's a et cetera, and that builds on that. And then hopefully you guys can get into this activity. If you can't, we will just sort of open it up to discussion. Let's render that as an idea. So the idea is grab out a card. You can just like render a box. It's purple, but you can just change it to white. And then drag a Post-it note that has your name selected. So this is like me, Chris. And then you can group those items together. And I'll give you guys 5 minutes to do that. If anyone can get into this, I'll try to do it on your phones. I don't know if it'll work on your phones, but maybe. I'm like, oh, okay, I can talk to it. In the comments, I placed links to those things. Okay. In the chat, yeah, for our session. Yes, in our session, there's some comments and there's a couple. You can drag on the computer. I know it will on your iPad, but that's the way. Like it's trying to do it. If it doesn't work, I will share this with you guys later. It's a sort of you could like copy this and do it with other students or engage that as you need. But there's a sort of opportunity to apply this. Similarly, I'll sort of show you in Visual Electric. Visual Electric is an AI, generative AI that sort of relies on this idea of like a quick sketch, and then it'll render out an idea. And quite useful for students for its speed, because you can sort of do that. Let's say we were doing like a man on a dwelling in space. Let's see, whatever. I can like draw a meteor. I can put a since I had maybe it's an igloo with a satellite dish. Oh, it's quick. Visual Electric. I have played with that one, no, but I. Oh. Yeah, it'll render it directly over. This you can copy SVG content and paste it in here as well. Oh, yeah, I've seen some of those high ends of rendering, but yeah, very like that's the sort of like where AI is sort of magical, right? Where it's like I'm doing it and it's changing it and it's modifying it as it goes. Harder to sort of sometimes show the initial value for students to some extent, but like showing them videos of that, it's just, yeah, stuff is rad. But where this stuff relatively quickly, what I always like to say is in experimenting with a lot of these AI tools is time constraining them as much as you can. Like 20-minute exercise where 10 minutes of it is drawing a little thing and another 10 minutes is rendering a solution. And then like nobody has a time to sort of overthink their drawing or to sort of see like it's the thing that was the only outputs. And then you can reflect on it. Well, how well did that work for you? Would you iterate it? What is the language you use to sort of communicate to the computer what you want to render? And if this is whatever, so my drawing that I'm doing, and then I say like, oh, I want this, and it's going to be a meteorite. This even sort of starts filling in an apocalyptic cityscape and an apocalyptic space with a igloo dome house flying through space, flying through a dense asteroid belt. Here you go. All right. And then you can hit render. Obviously, like any of these tools, I don't really pay for it. Like there's a certain number of free sessions. That's where like they get you focus, like practice with them to some extent. And what is sort of fascinating is like 2 minutes of me drawing less. I now have some weird igloo space. Look, it even like makes it a geodesic dome. Like I didn't ask for a geodesic dome. I didn't ask for it to be whatever Buckminster Fuller style, but oh, there's an igloo. See, close. Are these good? I don't know. Did it take me 2.5 minutes to have a discussion with students about like the quality of input and outputs? And the role of iteration in these is actually really fast for students to understand. Do it again if it sucked. Make a new one. And it renders 4 different versions for you. Render out the more versions of that thing. And in that ability for it to extend that, you're then training this feedback loop that the AI is assisting in. The role of that is quite powerful for students because they're like, my input wasn't that much. It was 5 minutes and I got an outcome. Yes.
This by two students. Same purpose. Very similar.
So one of the constraints of AI that which we were talking about before, you ask it to do the same thing, you change a little bit, and it renders 4 brand new visions for you. No, I wanted that, which is this thing tweaked. And that is something that's coming out. They're trying to work on that in a lot of research. There's the next thought art company I've worked for. And sure. And then that's a language discussion. If you want it to render differently, you have to tell the computer to render it differently. Like I gave it some words, it sort of is interpolating what that equals in space, but I'm like, oh, if yours needs to be on Mars and yours needs to be in an asteroid belt with a dune look and feel. And one of the challenges that we have in the AI world is that like it only learns from the stuff it knows, and then you'd be like, hey, make it look like Star Wars. And like, well, that's an owned IP. It's very challenging at which say like, well, what are you doing with that differently or unique? Yes.
The risk of the range of very similar.
In sort of style. Potentially, right? So this render, you can also style it. So here's where like if you want it to be fine art or I want it to be crafts. So this has a number of options which like correct. Well, and even with using rendering in ChatGPT or using Midjourney or any of these other tools, the level of specificity that is required on the end user to ask of the machine is where the skill of the designer and the artist comes into using it. And one of the things we like to talk to students about is like, what's fascinating about AI is you don't own the render. You own the prompt. So the more specific and unique and like IP driven the prompt is, that's what the designer owns. That's what the maker is owning. The actual visual thing that it spits out is owned by the AI company. This is where Adobe created a whole kerfuffle, like all these artists, like, what are you talking about? You own all my work that I make on your stuff. Like, no, I'm like, no. You get to train my thing and then call it yours. Like, not cool. But again, I'm not a AI IP lawyer to some extent, but it is in the wild west.
Where I would say we own the problem, it's not.
Well, the intellectual property, yeah, so you could argue that the intellectual property is yours because you own that, but the thing that it spits out is not owned by you because you didn't generate the code and the language and the outputs. Yes.
But it's basically writes the same.
What? Correct. Well, that potentially we have that weird future. But what's interesting is in like, if you go to the Midjourney Discord channel, like everyone's publishing their prompts because they're trying to train Midjourney better. And so there's this weird thing that I'm like, wait, why are you making me pay for Midjourney? I'm training your AI to do better. Like you should be paying me to produce stuff for you in that AI. And that honestly is a weird future that we have coming up. And I think there's even like students like, hey, go make some extra cash by like training an AI on the side. Like, or these guys that I work at Next.art, they were showing me that they're making independent owned IP AI models. So their use case that they showed me was a college athlete needs to be training in college, but wants to make money on his image. He could go in, do a photo shoot, train the AI to do things like, you need to hold a stick of detergent. Now the advertising agencies, whoever wants to use that image can just, and they can render his body in different paths. It's kind of fascinating. And that one is worth playing with as well. So there's like ones that you need different things with. Oh, you would need to render a body a certain way. You need to do a fashion model outputs. You need to do more art-driven stuff. These tools sort of align to that output, if that makes sense. And what makes this stuff, as I was saying, like renders it pretty quickly. Students can get a sense of a feedback loop really fast. I'll just show you, like, let's render this one as a collage. And you render it again. It modifies the existing view of that thing. And if you pay for it, it speeds up your rendering time. You can do multiple outputs. But the role which students sort of understand is that like this is doing very similar things that you as a student should be doing as well. It's not one idea. It's multiples of 4, multiples of 8. Do it 4 different ways and then make a choice. And what is dangerous about it is that we're moving designers more to the realm of I'm just making choices. I'm not making anything anymore. I'm just sort of allowing the computer to make a bunch of stuff and then I just get to sort of choose them. And the like sort of, oh no, person to me is like, well, yeah, and then we have the paradox of choice, right? How do you know it's any good if all you're doing is making a bunch of choices? But the role of designers output in that is helping other people make choices. Like what a designer does. We're making choices for a client who can't make them themselves or aren't any good at it. And we can tell a story in different ways and render those things meaningful out. Relative fun part of some of this stuff. Yes.
Freelance designer creating charges a ton, very successful, but he's saying that like this allows him to keep up where this is the initial round, we can make things that the client can okay, and he's gonna remake everything the way he does it.
Bingo.
But that conversation that happened on session instead of like, all right, I'll come back in 2 days to
Yeah, my wife is an architect. She's like, do you think this exists? Can I use this to like help my clients like make decisions about like their tile and background? I'm like, I would think so. And she's like, yeah, because what we're all solving is the gap. And the gap of what we are keeping training and showing students to understand is that your thinking goes into solving the gap. And if you can do that with speed and pace, you can then go after much different problems. Not that you have to use it to render a guy going on the moon, but it can be fun, but it can be more grounded in products, services, and outputs that are done. And what I've done with students recently is have them build scenarios. Is this the scenario one? So they were working on UX scenarios and design, like what is the problem? How do you visualize it? Here's, I've got a food truck in Miami. This one's mine as a sample. But here's students like, oh, I need a car app. Like, that's pretty boring. That AI made a very boring UI.
like just dull as stones. But then like here, like I'm working on a storyboard. I can't render these people very well, but I can use AI to help me string together a story that's more compelling for what I'm solving, and then allows you to iterate on that human-centered component, what that idea is in the first place, and then how you ultimately communicate why you got there in the first place, that kind of stuff. Especially in a classroom of 3 hours or 20 minutes, you're like, well, yeah, this is kind of hard. If I told you to make a storyboard, you would fail, probably. But I can help you make one little drawing, render that in a way, and now you can iterate it. Get it closer to your story. You're not being descriptive enough with the AI, which means you weren't being descriptive enough about the story in the first place. So that feedback loop, I could tell you that all day long, but you are now learning that by the act of doing that in the classroom. And then students sort of get more motivated, or they're sort of excited. It's like, so can I say I made this? I'm like, no. You didn't make any of those things. You prompted an AI. Just be explicit in your portfolio and your case studies and the stories you're telling about people, about the tools you use. How's that any different than I use Figma to make this storyboard, or make this AI, or make this app? Most of us don't make the entirety of the thing anyways. We make small button, a small output. We're using a design system that we never have had our hands in making in the first place. We're just assembling the pieces. That's sort of boo-hoo way of thinking about the cool shit we get to make. But there's also this opportunity to say, well, doing this at speed and pace with your students and showing them that there's a possibility there actually improves their ability to conceptualize ideas and put them in the world. Oh, we got 2 minutes, Bernie, as I sort of come to the end of my talk, or do that. If you have questions, what I was going to do here. There's more here. We did this activity. Contact, whatever, reach out with me on LinkedIn, outputs. I'm happy to chat here about this stuff. I love working with students. Most of them think this stuff is cool, which is helpful, right? The students are like, oh yeah, that's cool. Like, yeah, but your story sucks. They're like, oh. I'm like, well, like this is like what they made a boring app, and I'm like, you made it boring. It didn't have to be boring. Like, what? Like, these are all your decisions. Like, let's find a way at which to understand that opportunity space, use these tools quickly to sort of translate that, and then whatever. And then I'm like, go out in the world, go make this stuff, go show people that you know how to do this. Enter into a space where they're not using these tools, and say, well, how do we see the options? Well, look, I just rendered a million of them. What is that supposed to do for them?
What was early perceived was the end result.
Yeah, so I have been using it early in the process. So like for storyboarding, for figuring out the problems, for ideating, for sort of in the outputs. But I'm like, but if you're using an AI to generate your final AI product, your final application, your UI, you're doing it wrong. That's what you're like. There's too much nuance there that you need to own. And but the role of ideas up front is hard to grasp, right? Like which one has the most fertile ground to go after? And if they can do these quickly, like most of them will start with 2 or 3 ideas. Like, well, which one are you going to choose? Let's render a couple ideas, see how it produces that, how well you've thought through the process, and then that is the one you drive down. You could always circle back. Most of the design we're going to do is you're going to get to a place where you have to circle back. That's the role of this opportunity. But AI tools like these in classroom spaces allow students to quickly circle back on their ideas, understand that they're not thinking deeply enough about their outputs. And then we get to learn ourselves. Like, right, whatever. I was like, did that prompt work? Like the first I was like, I don't know. My wife was like, I have no idea if this is going to produce an interesting outcome. And then we do it later, and you're like, oh, well, now the prompt is then on the instructor. People are teaching. How do you get people to sort of put in interesting inputs that help them understand what they're doing, but also then result in more. Well, hopefully, whatever you guys take some of these ideas, go back to your students, say like, hey, this is worth experimenting with, worth working on. Students should be using them anyway. They are anyways. And once it's like, oh yeah, it's like, did you make that? They're like, no. And I'm like, yeah, want to know how I can tell? Because it looks like AI, and I have never seen you make anything like this before. So don't try and pass it off. Be explicit about what you're making.
What is why we when they go to change your word. And
Yeah, and again, there's like a lot of this that is worth students experimenting with, but like there's this article at the end that I was talking about, like before and after you remove AI from your sort of Google search and outputs, like how much of what we're actually seeing is being rendered by this world of outputs. And the one of the big problems is that it produces so much. Even students can do a lot, but a lot of it's trash. It's not fundamentally any good. And there's this other designer that I follow. It's like, he's like, I think we need to create an AI you know, you have an R rating on a movie. Like it needs this has been rendered with AI in some meaningful way, so that we can sort of get a sense of what has a quality level or not. And students have the same. They're working on their quality levels. I can show you how you can take a really crappy sketch and render it quickly through AI, but that doesn't necessarily equal you to be a really great AI person. You're still a student working throughout that version. But with practice, taking those skills to places that don't know how to do these things, you will look like a freaking genius. You'll go to places that are like, oh yeah, we're still flipping, you know, stuff out of newspapers to get a sense of what's happening in the world. And you're like, but that exists in some spaces. I mean, again, overgrown. You'll hear me talk about things like we're still rolling hills up the road, but tools like this, again, align to an opportunity and then help them sketch it. What I've always asked writers. Started at the drawing and writing stage, they get much better at those things. They will use AI much better. Most of them will come to like, I don't know, make me a house. They're like, what? It doesn't. Do you know how many houses there are? Like, go out in the world and go take a photo of 5 different houses, any of them the same? Like, oh, they all got a front door. Like, oh. Okay, this is the thing about being a designer that's important. It's about the nuance. Increase that nuance with exponential skills, tools. Then you can sort of show the world that you can make those decisions faster, render the world faster. Yes.
So, that's a lot of the word rendering the world.
Mm-hmm.
How do you teach your students through a social justice lens of using such a product where their background and their experiences, some people don't know what concepts like because they kind of they don't have that experience of grew up in
Sure.
they don't have family background. So when you take the perspective of such a tool can also be weaponized.
Absolutely.
So how do you educate students with varying disparities within their classroom? They don't know exactly because they didn't go to high school and go to AICAD events.
Sure.
It has the verbiage to use such a tool to their advantage. How do you leverage that in that space?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And most of that becomes with the feedback that even that house example. There is no definition of a house. Like everyone will define it differently. And that's where the empathy piece of you understanding what your point of view is or your understanding of that concept is changes and will then be sort of and can be hyper focused in other tools. The AI, this article here, AI, we talk about empathy all the time in the world in which we design human-centered systems and how we use the tools through that human-centered lens. The only way to recognize the human-centered lens is being skewed is to know that the tools are skewing them. And if you can undo what the tool can make, you can see the problems that exist. Whatever. I think the keynote speech for this talk is about how AI, how algorithms can be biased, and because they're made by human beings. I don't have any solution outside of that. Is that, well, you got to give a shit. You got to care about those things, and then that allows you to use those tools to either circumvent that avenue or recognize when it's not producing reality. Most of what AI, none of those things. This is a man on the moon. That's sort of why we started that space. Like, don't try and render a a home in Africa. You would see it do the most stereotypical sort of like make you like gag in your life thing, because it's just like rendering this sort of biased, unrealistic space.
The very definition of privilege is you don't know.
So you have
If
to.
you don't know when you're not exposed, it means you are privileged because you have no exposure to the thing that you can be very biased. So trying to teach people about bias, they've never been exposed to it, is very difficult. So having that conversation is beyond just the realm of creating something, it's really a social context. So not understanding from the background in which you came. Empathy comes from a space where you understand somebody's perspective because you've been there, you've experienced it. What you're trying to do is really amplify sympathy, and that I may not know what you're walking, but if I can get a purview of what it is you're going through, I can somehow identify where my privilege stands. And we all have it.
Sure.
But if we don't know the biases that we carry, we're going to write it into the algorithms of how we code, how we craft,
How we render.
right? But it's based on the conversation of the development part.
Sure.
And identifying where all your students lay. If they don't feel safe in their classroom to have that conversation, it's really hard to get to the next stage of learning.
Sure. But, and that's where the speed at which you could render the reality or the scenario, the situation, and then the discussion of how do you know it's authentic? How do you know this is actually reflecting the space which you're trying to solve a problem for? You may not know. So that, and everything has a gap. Like we have to build, everything is built assumptions into it. We've used tools with a lot of trust. But the minute you create too many barriers to that, then students go, I'm never going to use that thing ever because it's baking in too many problems in my process. And that actually may be true as well. These things are brand new. Most of them are terribly put together with speed and pace. And we don't really know some of the implications of doing that, except the fact that if we can teach designers who are going to enter into the world and make these things better, if they can use them effectively and usefully in the way in which they are rendering empathy, sympathy, outputs, spaces, designing things for that aren't themselves, like all those things that we sort of talk about with lots of like fervor, then that, sort of like rose-colored view of that, like, well, at least we'll make better systems, we'll make better tools. The ones that are bad are going to go away, and the ones that actually allow us to address those problems and tweak and iterate those things that are not good. And that hopefully that's the before round. I have no way to know that's true. A lot of it is very, very complicated, but you have to say that's the world you're occupying. You don't get to live in a safe, bubbly space with your designs and your ideas. They have to live in the world. They have to extend to audiences you don't know. You got to go out in the world and do that. If you can start producing that at speed back into the tools that they're making, then they're more advantageous to go to. That's fine. She's like, you're not going to learn anything, but sitting here doing that, like you got to get out in the world. Go do that. Learn from the system. Build it back into your outputs, and then if it's getting close, that's your learning space. That's what you build that. That's a great question. And I know we're past time, so thank you everyone for coming. It was really great to have you. That's the sun.
I'm going to stop. Zoom in. Stop sharing.